Hi everybody, welcome along to another episode of The Dispatches. My name is Brendan Malone. It is great to be back with you again. And in today's episode, I want to talk about the Tuam mother and baby's home, this place that was a historic residential facility for unwed mothers, and I think also for abandoned children as well, in Ireland. And you might remember a few years ago that there was a quote-unquote mass grave found on the property there. And this is an historic site. Young babies, young children were interred in the mass grave. That's what people were calling it. And when you use that phrase, mass grave, it obviously carries a lot of very serious connotations, not least of which is the possibility of deliberate killing, like genocidal type killing. And so it had a lot of powerful cultural cachet when people started seeing these media reports. And automatically what happened was people started jumping to all sorts of conclusions about what had gone on here. Had these Irish Catholic nuns many decades ago deliberately killed young children and babies? Were they perhaps lacking in care and regard for these people? And did they even show them the basic respect by giving them a proper burial? All these kinds of things are embroiled in this. Well, this particular story has come around again. And once again, in the last couple of weeks, it is now back in the media big time. And as per usual, exactly what we saw last time, there were all sorts of myths and false claims that were made. And so I thought today we'd explore this particular issue. And I think this is important because A, it's never good to have lies and falsehoods out there. B, I think often the Christian church can be a very easy whipping boy. And the Christian church is often very unfairly targeted and maligned, and there doesn't seem to be that same regard for getting the facts straight. It's more prejudicial and bigoted. You know, it basically, people will believe things if it justifies their pre-existing prejudices about the church. And a lot of people have prejudices about the church. I think it was, who was it, Fulton Sheen, who might have said, there's not 100 people in all of America who hate the Catholic Church, but there is thousands upon thousands of them who hate what they wrongly believe the Catholic Church to be. And this is one of those classic examples. And so I think it's first to correct the record whenever falsehood is out there, but also secondly, there are some very big ramifications for these kind of lies. Like we saw a similar kind of falsehood, not exactly the same, but a claim that was made about different care homes that were traditionally run by the Catholic Church in Canada for native Indian peoples there. And you actually saw people burning down churches on the back of that. The reaction to that was actually quite horrific. And no one really seemed to care about correcting the record. And no one seemed particularly bothered about the fact that these churches in Canada were being burnt down as a direct result of what turned out to be, like, well, as you're going to see here with this Tuam incident as well, more fabrications and falsehoods. And so I think it's important to sort of set the record straight, and I thought we'd do that by diving into this article by a guy called John McGurk. Let's have a look at what he has to say. One of the things about being known as a person who writes and talks about Irish politics and society for a living is that people tend to offer you their opinions by way of making conversation on a regular basis. Oftentimes, these opinions are mild and conversational. At other times, they can be aggressive and challenging. I had the latter experience early last year at a social event when a professional woman I know slightly through friends challenged me on the Tuam mother and baby home. "How can you defend the church?" she asked, after the way those babies were slaughtered and thrown in a sewer at Tuam, because this is one of the big allegations, that they basically just threw them into a septic tank. The word slaughtered stuck with me, since she seemed to really believe that nuns in Tuam had been wringing the necks, or worse, of babies born to unwed mothers. Regular readers will know two things. First, I am not what one would call a stalwart defender of the Roman Church. Secondly, that I rarely, if ever, write about Tuam or other mother and baby homes. In other words, this is not a pet activist hobby or project for him. But it became apparent to me quickly in that conversation that neither of these things mattered much to my interlocutor. To her, I was simply the nearest representative of Ireland's dark past, and a vessel into which she could pour her disgust and outrage. And that's often how these conversations go. If you've ever been in one of these, you know exactly what he's saying here. And sure enough, the conversation turned soon to my role in the abortion referendum of 2018, where it was alleged that I had tried to condemn even more Irish women to that kind of fate, the one suffered, she alleged, by those dead children in Tuam, because he was very involved in leading the pro-life pushback against the attempt to liberalise abortion in Ireland. This week, a literal excavation has begun in Tuam. If one could previously have said, and by the way, this article is from July, so middle of July is when this excavation began. If one could previously have said metaphorically that digging up the past was a favourite pastime of modern Ireland, we can now say it literally. The broad outline of what happened at Tuam is already established, or at least established to the fullest extent possible for events that took place in an institution that closed its doors 64 years ago. The state has already completed an extensive commission of investigation into the mother and baby homes, of which a 63-page detailed report on Tuam was the centrepiece. Anyone with even the slightest interest in Tuam should read it. He's absolutely right, you definitely should read it. That report makes a few important points, most of which I think are unknown to the public. Certainly, they were unknown to the very angry woman who upbraided me about Tuam last year. First, the Tuam Mother and Baby Home was a state institution, not a church institution. So this is really, really important to understand. A lot of people are talking about this like this is a church facility. It was a state institution. That it was managed by the Bon Secours sisters, an order of Catholic nuns, the Bon Secours, is true enough, but it was funded, often disgracefully underfunded, by the Galway County Council. Second, the vast majority of admissions to the home were made not at the behest of the church, but of the state. The report notes, and this is a quote from the report, the records of admission pathways are very incomplete, but of those that exist, the most common referrals were by the local health authority or by a dispensary doctor/medical officer. Galway local authority records show that officials made serious efforts to pursue the putative fathers of these children for maintenance or to secure a contribution from the woman's family. In June 1930, the CHHAC recommended that all women admitted to Tuam should be interviewed by the county solicitor. In December 1930, the senior assistance officer visited and interviewed all the women. He reported that they were mostly servant girls. The putative fathers tended to be labourers or servant boys. And I think that aspect of the story is obviously quite important. The nature of what this home was, how it operated, and how these women came to be here. And obviously these women in very exploited situations. You can see already from just that paragraph. Third, that the nuns regularly implored the state for more funding to improve conditions at the home and provide basic things like a running water supply and workable heating for the dormitories. And this is something that I've heard no one else talk about, that the nuns actually were constantly seeking the funding they needed to just provide the basic modicum of care that you would expect to provide to women in this situation, and it wasn't forthcoming from the Irish state. Fourth, that the state actively placed limits on the care offered to pregnant women at the home. Another direct quote from the report. In 1947, Miss Litster also commented that many Tuam mothers received no prenatal care. She criticised the county manager for issuing an order that prohibited the admission of expectant mothers chargeable to County Galway, not Company Galway, prior to the 7th month of pregnancy. So in other words, the state was actually prohibiting good care of these women. Then in 1951, another report noted that the memorandum indicated that a number of causes were given for the high death rate at Tuam, the chief one being lack of prenatal care, a cause which the authorities of the home cannot remedy. It added that several other improvements in the home itself are necessary both in personnel and facilities. Note the pattern here. The state at each step of the way was refusing to provide the basic tools needed to improve the home and reduce the infant mortality rate. A significant portion of the deaths were being attributed by the state to a lack of prenatal care. This is in official reports, remember, we've just heard from. But that same state was insistent that such prenatal care would not be funded or provided. The nuns had no input into that decision and argued against it, as you would expect. Caring, celibate women who have given their lives to the bride of Christ and to the care of the vulnerable. A previous report in 1945 had noted that the nuns were desperate to have central heating installed in order to improve the chances and prospects of infants in their care. And you read that statement, it's just shocking when you think about how basic the lack was and the disregard from the state in this situation. This too appears to have been denied by the county council. Babies were being left exposed to the cold, but not at the nuns' behest. So this is really, really important. This really speaks to intentionality, to motive, to who was actually at fault here, moral culpability, etc. These nuns are doing their best under very difficult circumstances to care for vulnerable women who have been abandoned by wider society. Fifth, contemporary reports made absolutely clear what the causes of death in Tuam were. It is worth quoting this paragraph in full. Miss Litster said that it was time to inquire into possible causes of death before the rate became higher. She noted that there was a constant risk of infection because of admissions of entire families, itinerants, destitutes, evicted persons, etc., into the children's home. So in other words, whole families, entire groups of people were actually being admitted all at the same time into this place. She remarked that Dr. Dillon had previously drawn attention to this in 1945. There was no isolation unit, which meant that children newly admitted were mingling with others in the home, and there was no routine examination and testing for venereal diseases. Dr. Costello was praised for his keen interest in the welfare of the children, their progress and diet. However, he was then 80 years old, and Miss Litster commented, "I think we are entitled to ask that the advice and assistance of a younger doctor with more up-to-date knowledge and methods should be available." This report stated that the infants received good care in the children's home, the Bon Secours sisters being careful and attentive, and excellent diets were available. It is not here that we must look for the cause of the death rate. So here's the official government report saying it's not the fault of the nuns. There are other factors that are actually contributing to this high death rate. Take all of this together, and what do you get? The state's own Commission of Investigation into Tuam paints a very clear picture, which is presumably why that commission's own report has been so poorly reported. It paints a picture of a state that essentially gave the nuns a job but refused to offer even the most basic supports. It shows us that it was the state, not the church, that referred mothers and their children to the home. It shows us an order of nuns constantly imploring the state for more resources and being denied. It shows us a state that was constantly investigating death rates in the home, but constantly refusing to take the basic measures required to reduce those death rates. Somehow, in the Irish media and popular imagination, this has been twisted into an image of feral and malevolent nuns sweeping up vulnerable women and subjecting them to the most awful and at times murderous abuse. This is an image based entirely on cultural currents in modern Ireland rather than any of the available facts about what actually went on. So in other words, current prejudice is being applied here. And you can kind of see why, because it's not really in the state's interest to take a lot of responsibility here when they've got a very easy whipping boy in the Catholic Church. And if people are looking more at them and blaming them, maybe they're not asking questions like, well, perhaps the Irish state actually should be considered culpable here. And maybe also there are people alive today who might actually be entitled to and owed some compensation by them. Now, the state has commenced a 2-year excavation of bones at the site, formerly for the purpose of identifying some of the remains of children who died, in the vast majority of circumstances from illnesses and infection before the age of 1. But the reality, as the state's own Commission of Investigation shows, is that demand for the home was fueled by the state and its civic administrators, that the nuns were completely under-resourced and overwhelmed, and that the nuns were the very people imploring the state for aid that never came. What has been perpetrated here on the Irish psyche is a calumny of the most egregious kind. It is a form of fictional history designed to legitimise modern prejudices, in which the worst things that Irish society did were actually inflicted upon us by these Christian religious orders. Irony of ironies, the belief in the nuns' villainy has become a kind of religious conviction in and of itself. evidence be damned. So in other words, the prejudice is more important than the actual truth. I don't care what the evidence shows, the prejudice must win out, even to the point of subverting the truth to keep the lie alive. All the while, Irish society has simply found new and more efficient ways to dispose of inconvenient and unwanted children, as the enormous surge in the abortion rate in Ireland would tend to confirm. If you're interested in what happened in Tuam, read the state's own report. If you're mainly interested in condemning the nuns, then I suggest you give it a miss. And that is an excellent article, and I think it was, well, hopefully you'll see why you thought I considered this to be something of value and importance for us to actually revisit and have a look at here today. Because, as I said, this story has gone global once again, and once again, the prejudicial, bigoted falsehoods have sort of given rise and really given fire to this mythology about who's to blame here and what actually went on. I think it's always important in these situations to be well informed. So before you believe something, and in fact, I think the more egregious the claim or the allegation is, the more cautious I think we should be about discerning and being people of prudence to ensure that we're actually getting the truth here and we are not running off 100 miles an hour with a complete falsehood. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget, live by goodness, truth, and beauty, not by lies. And I'll see you next time on The Dispatches.